Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for enduring the day's cold and what always strikes me as a premature autumn nightfall on this first day of November to attend a special lecture on his inaugural visit to our university by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. I'm especially pleased to have Professor Sir Hilary Beckles here, as I've met him first reading his seminal work in Caribbean history on slavery and women, and then when he spoke at New York University, where I completed my doctoral studies. I'm Dr. Melina Papademas, Interim Director of the Africana Studies Institute, and as the director, it is the best part of my responsibilities to both configure and facilitate the role that the Institute plays on our campus, in our immediate surrounding communities, and in our state of Connecticut. At the same time, like most campus events, this event would not have been possible without multiple vehicles of support. Sincere appreciation is due then to the Office of Global Affairs, the Humanities Institute, the Department of History, El Instituto, Institute for Latinx, Caribbean and Latin American Studies, the UConn and Instituto Caribbean Initiative, Scholars House, and the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History. I would be remiss, too, if I did not give due appreciation to Africana's Program Administrator, Amanda Canada, as well as the wonderful logistical work of Grace Jutan of the University of the West Indies during the many weeks leading up to Vice-Chancellor Beckles' visit. Finally, I must highlight that Professor Beckles' visit would not have been possible without the acumen and care of Dr. Fiona Vernal, Interim Associate Director of the Africana Studies Institute, who has been at the center of arrangements for Vice-Chancellors Sir Hilary Beckles' visit as part of her own commitment to adjusting the volume on certain of Connecticut's pasts. She has worked extensively and in numerous capacities on behalf of the Caribbean diaspora communities in the Hartford area, most directly among members of the Anglophone Caribbean diaspora. In addition to launching multiple exhibits on Caribbean social, cultural, and immigration histories, Dr. Vernal conducts oral interviews, has cataloged archival papers for diaspora organizations, and has engaged in multiple forms of community support. You might say her work has actively served to sculpt the face of Connecticut's Anglophone Caribbean diaspora, which is to say that these residents' histories are as much Connecticut history as they are part of the history and legacy of the islands of the Caribbean. It is fitting, then, that she introduce our distinguished guest. Without ado, Dr. Fiona Vernal.
Welcome. Thank you for turning out. I, too, am pleased to welcome Sir Hilary Beckles to our campus on this slightly gray, dull afternoon. We can never compete with the weather of the University of the West Indies, so we are not just going to own up to it and move on. Before assuming his current position of Vice-Chancellor in 2015, Sir Hilary served as Professor of Economic History, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Undergraduate Studies, and Principal of its Cave Hill campus in Barbados for 13 years, from 2002 to 2015. He has had, and continues to have, a distinguished academic career, becoming the youngest scholar at the university to be promoted to a personal chair. Sir Hilary has received great renown and acclaim as an academic leader and expert, both in higher education administration, as well as in the study of slavery and of cricket, where he launched his very important book, Cricket Without a Cause, last night at a very well-attended event in Hartford, which we were very pleased to support as well. In his many, many, many roles, he has served as on many United Nations committees and advisory panels. He was called upon by Secretary Ban Ki-moon to serve as an inaugural member of his Science Advisory Board on Sustainable Development. He also served as an advisor on UNESCO Cities for Peace global program and was an advisor to the UN World Culture Report. For many years, he was a lead conceptualizer of UNESCO's Slavery Project and currently serves as the Vice President. He's also a member of the UNDP Advisory Panel on the Caribbean Human Development Report. These and many other positions provide just a very tiny glimpse of the fundamental ways in which our eminent guest has helped to shape the public discourse, research agendas, and public policy thinking and planning for the Caribbean. Sir Hilary's robust record of publications explores the history of Barbados, for example, explores Caribbean slave society and economy, explores Caribbean revolts and revolutions, the history of women. His most recent scholarship on slavery focuses on the history of reparations. And in the last few years, the subject of reparations has refracted unevenly in American public discourse. On our own campus here at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, we have hosted several speakers who have helped us to frame the many overlapping struggles for social justice and the acknowledgement of the economic and political debts wrought by colonialism and slavery. For example, Caroline Elkins was here a few years back, who offered really important insights on reparations in relation to the Mau Mau conflict in Kenya. Ta-Nehisi Coates was here just 2 years ago. His very important article on The Atlantic, which was then and still now the most read issue of that magazine, also helped to reinvigorate the debate about the system of wealth and theft that underpins the American slavery for centuries. Sir Hilary's seminal book, Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Caribbean Slavery and Native Genocide, offered a resounding condemnation of Great Britain's continued denial of slavery as a crime against humanity and led to the creation of the Caribbean Reparations Commission, and continues this very important intervention into what is the state of reparations, what should be done about reparations, what should reparations look like. This lecture today, its predecessors, the ones to come around this very important topic, and the Caribbean Reparations Commission itself, inspired by Sir Hilary's work, serve as a treatise, as a plea, and as a form of public education for us all at once. The work of this commission promises to be a watershed moment in the fight for social justice and global reparations, and we are honored to welcome Sir Hilary as our distinguished guest to share his vision of the reparations movement and its trajectories now. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming Sir Hilary.
Very good evening, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here in your very prestigious academy. I thank you, Fiona, for extending this invitation. I know you have been pretty nervous all afternoon as I was moving around the state. I know you wondered whether I would have made it back in time, but we are part of an old struggle, and time is important to all of us. And I thank you and all of your colleagues, faculty members, officials, students. Very good evening, everyone. I'm happy to know that my intervention this evening is part of an ongoing conversation you're having here at UConn. This is comforting. It gives me satisfaction to know that I'm just adding my voice to an ongoing dialogue, and enables me to say that this is not a lecture, this is my intervention in that ongoing conversation. But I will say a few words about how it is that I have come to this moment, especially since I see the majority of us here this evening are young folks, students mostly. Now, at the age of 17, I thought I would be a philosopher, and off I went to major in philosophy. That was my orientation. That was how my teenage mind was structured. It was the one discipline through my high school years that I was fascinated by, the philosophical issues that are shaping the modern world. And off I went to major in philosophy. But circumstances have determined that I ought to reflect upon that in greater detail. In fact, one of my professors in my first semester a Jewish guy his family were Holocaust survivors. And he said to me in his office, what is a black working class guy going to do with a degree in philosophy? Now, that was a very interesting question. He imagined that I would have been a dysfunctional graduate, unemployable, with no future other than having great conversations with my friends. And he suggested I ought to do something quite different. He says, look at the world. Look at the shape of the black world, Africa. Look at Asia. Look at the diasporas of the Caribbean. Look at the civil rights movement in the USA. Wouldn't you wish to be a part of that? I thought, well, I'm already a part of that. He says, well, this is my advice to you. And of course, this is a conversation in a British university. He said, my advice to you is to study economic development. Study the contemporary world as it is, global poverty, the emergence of the Western world. Understand the post-colonial struggles of peoples in developing countries, especially small island states. You ought to change your major from philosophy to economic history, and that's precisely what I did. And that became the basis, I suspect, of why these matters, these conversations have been important to me ever since. But the context was important. I was born into a working class family in Barbados on a sugar estate, a sugar plantation. And my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, going back to slavery, were all connected to that world of labor exploitation. In fact, my grandparents worked on a sugar estate that was owned by the family of Benedict Cumberbatch, who you all know as a great actor. One of my favorite actors, you all know him, brilliant, distinguished actor. And his family owned sugar plantations from the slavery period into the 1960s in Barbados. And the Cumberbatch family, of course, is a very distinguished slave-owning family, and out of that wealth came the Cumberbatch dynasty, and he is the latest global star of that journey. But my grandmother's name was Cumberbatch, and there you go with the history of identity. The question is Benedict my cousin? I do not know. But what I do know is that this plantation has produced an academic and an actor. And I don't know if they're related. That is the nature of history, and of slavery in particular, because it denies the African peoples a right to a past. It denies, this is one of the damaging legacies. You do not know your family. You do not know your history because the records are broken and fragmented and considered not important. But I was growing up as a teenager in Birmingham City. My family had immigrated like many dreamers, leaving the Caribbean world, off to England to dream, to find a space for themselves and for their kids. And I was transported out of Barbados into Birmingham City. But as I walked around the city, all of the names in this Britain's second largest city, all of these names are familiar to me. All of these places and the names on big buildings, the names on the streets, the names on all the corporations, these names on the banks, they were all familiar because I had seen them before. I had seen them in Barbados. I had seen them in the Caribbean. Of course, I did my little research as a high school kid to discover these are the same people who had shaped the world in which I was born in Barbados. And now here I am in Birmingham, and the same people are shaping this environment as well. What is the connection? Therein lies the beginning of this story. Because the journey from Barbados in the Caribbean to Birmingham at the heart of England, I discovered it was really a domestic journey. I had not traveled beyond my cultural space. It was the same landscape. It was the same community. I had traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic to discover I had gone back to the place from where I have come from. That was quite an extraordinary discovery. And thus, the decision to study all of this and to begin as a teenager to try to put the pieces together. And I chose Hull University. Could have gone any place I wanted to go, but I chose Hull because Hull was the university that was built on the legacy of William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce, in his great heroic journey to end the slave trade in Britain and to drive the humanitarian process in England at the end of the 18th century, he was the Member of Parliament for Hull. And therefore he left a legacy which spawned Hull University. And therefore I thought I should enter into the legacy of William Wilberforce. Now, those were decisions taken as a teenager to connect the dots in a search through all of this. But why philosophy? Because I was interested in the morality of major historical decisions. I was interested in humanity as it is constructed in the modern world, and I was fascinated by the concept of injustice of all kinds, whether they be ethnic injustices, gender injustices, class injustices. I became concerned about the discourse around injustice and development. And those were the dialogues that drove me into an interface of philosophy and economic development. That has brought me hither. So that's a little biographical background that will, I hope, help you to understand the logic of my presentation and the significance of it. I also believe that this conversation about reparatory justice is going to be the greatest global movement in this 21st century. And I believe universities have an important role to play in all of this. Why do I think this is going to be the greatest movement of the 21st century? Well, all of you have seen the incipient forms of this movement. All parts of the world today, people are speaking about reparatory justice. I have given a version or various versions of this presentation in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. There are groups of people in formal politics, in NGOs, grassroots organizations, in universities, in governments, in public corporations, in international agencies, who are all seeking to address this matter. So, a month ago, it might have been Johannesburg, then it might have been Ghana, Nigeria, but everywhere this conversation is taking place. And there are reasons why this is so. It is because there is a growing feeling that this is, in some ways, the final stage of a human and civil rights movement. That modernity, as we understand it, built on this horrendous crime against humanity, the genocide of indigenous peoples all over the world, the development of chattel slavery and its globalization, the struggle for justice and freedom in the 19th century, the rise of nation states, including this nation state, out of that rubble of slavery and colonization. And nations are erupting all over the world out of this history. They are all faced with the same predicaments. They all have the same fundamental legacies. The conversations that you're all a part of in this nation is very similar to conversations in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. How do we go forward? How do we build just and humane societies within the context of this history, which we all know to be one of the darkest moments in human development? Now, there is no carpet in the world big enough to brush it under. And despite some heroic efforts to do so, it has not succeeded. And it has not succeeded because humanity, it seems, is forging towards a sense of fulfillment in which all human beings have a right to live their dreams and to enjoy justice and freedom. There are fundamental issues here. Importantly, I think universities have a critical role to play in being the midwife of this discourse. Simply because universities were at the center of its construction in the first place. The narrative that led to the legitimization of chattel slavery, the definition of African peoples as not human, subhuman property, real estate, chattel, those conversations were based on research that came out of universities. Intellectuals were at the center of this structure, and many of them were university professors. So when you trace the origins of these global crimes, the source invariably goes back to the role of universities in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. So let's say as academics, we were fundamental in the construction of this world. We have a role to play in its deconstruction. It's the responsibility we cannot avoid. I'm sure that many of you would have been schooled, for example, in the writings of John Locke, quintessential British European philosopher of the 17th century, associate professor of Oxford, and arguably the most respected British European philosopher on the question of justice and liberty. The question remains, how could Locke, for example, distinguished formal professor, respected academic, emerge as the leading theoretician on the concept of human freedom and liberty while being a slave owner? How did he square the dots? He was a major slave owner in the Bahamas. He was also the corporate secretary of the Royal African Company, which was constructed in 1672 to transport 6,000 Africans per year to the Caribbean, to the Carolinas and Virginia. Now, how did Professor Locke manage all of these identities while being a great author and theoretician? Well, he squared that very simply by saying that my theoretical writings about justice, liberty, humanity, equality are not meant to include the African peoples. They are outside of this discourse, simply because they are subhuman and they are languishing in a state of ethnic backwardness. And this is how he formulates this to explain what was apparently a contradiction. But the contradiction will not go away, because even then, at the height of these crimes, there were university academics, authors, philosophers, theologians, who were saying at the time of the emergence of this global system, this is not only wrong, this is a criminal activity. It is immoral, it's unjust. So at the height of the globalization of slavery and the slave trade, there were powerful intellectual voices in Britain, in Europe, in this country, who were critical of what was taking place. But there was always, and always continues to be, the famous equation. And I would urge you, as young folks, if any time you hear someone say, especially someone in a powerful position, it is in the national interest, run for cover. In the national interest is a powerful concept. In a democracy, it is hard to deny it. But the most heinous crimes have been committed by empowered elites on the basis that it is in the national interest. And therefore, to oppose such activity is to enter into the realm of treason, lack of patriotism, and so on. Very few individuals actually wish to be so identified in a democracy as being standing and representing forces and ideas that are considered not to be in the national interest. Slavery and its globalization was determined in every country of Western Europe and the emergent North American, US nation, and later on Canada. Slavery was seen and defined as, despite opposition, despite formidable opposition, and that opposition was brushed aside, to be in the national interest. And that concept of in the national interest was articulated not only in the economic interest of the nation, but in the cultural and moral interests of those elites. These are important issues to us. Universities were at the center of this construction. And universities are now having to deal with their own legacies. And many of you, I'm sure, are following the conversations around universities in this nation that were not only built upon the economics of slavery, but have survived and became prestigious by the endowments of slave owners and so on. I've participated in conversations at Brown University, at Harvard University, Georgetown. All of these distinguished institutions are now trying to confront this. My own University of the West Indies is also dealing with this, though from a different perspective. At one of our campuses, the Mona campus in Jamaica, which is our first campus built in 1948. Just recently, we were constructing a new medical faculty. All the arrangements were made. This is going to be a state-of-the-art medical complex with all of the facilities that our medical faculty would require. The bulldozers came in and they started to dig up the foundation to construct this edifice. But more than dirt was coming up from the foundation. The bones of enslaved Africans began to emerge from the ground. Because the very site where the faculty was being built, the very site was an 18th century slave cemetery that had gone unmarked and unknown. And all of these bones began to come from the ground, thereby forcing an interesting conversation. How did we not know that this was the site of a burial ground of enslaved Africans who were enslaved on the Mona sugar plantation for 200 years? We now have to confront that. History comes to you from the ground. You wish to cover it up, you wish to ignore it. The ancestors are speaking from beyond the grave. And we move now to, let's say, the Barbados Campus at Cave Hill, which is a campus where I was provost for 13 years. Well, we decided to do a history of this campus and a history of the space which is occupied by this campus. And we discovered that there was a character who we have now defined as our first academic. In 1798, a 4-year-old child by the name of Qua was sold on the auction block in Bridgetown. He was the son of a family that were destroyed in a slave raid on their community in Guinea. The children were just picked up and thrown on the slave ship, and he arrived in Barbados at the age of 4. The slave owner goes to the Bridgetown harbor to make his purchase and sees this 4-year-old child and buys this child as a toy for his own 4-year-old child. These two 4-year-old children, one enslaved and one white and free, one enslaved, became good friends. They discover that this child somehow had a computational capacity that was seen as extraordinary. This child could do mathematical calculations without tuition, and they could not figure this out. But in the end, they decided, well, since this child is a gifted child, let him do the bookkeeping. So by the age of 13, young Paul is the bookkeeper of the estate. Later on, he teaches himself to write and to read all kinds of fancy literature. Emancipation comes, and young Paul is seen as arguably the most literate person on the island in the black community. The Church of England, they built a chapel on the plantation, and Paul becomes the sexton. The sexton is the person who manages the affairs of the church. He becomes the first black sexton of an Anglican church anywhere in the world. But critically, he becomes a Sunday school teacher. And he's teaching all of the black children on the plantation, all the little enslaved children. He's teaching them to read and to write and to read the Bible and so on and so forth. So this Paul becomes the first teacher on our campus location, because our campus was built precisely on that plantation where Paul was enslaved. Paul becomes the first teacher on our campus. And thus we now have a monument to respect the legacy of this child who became an academic. Now, all over the world, these matters have been dealt with. In Africa, in Brazil, in India, in China, where African people were also enslaved. All over the world, where slavery had been globalized, communities are dealing with this. As you heard, one of the projects I'm involved in, I'm the Vice President of the UNESCO Slave Roots Project. We carry out major research all over the world where chattel slavery took root and became an important institution. And so we travel around the world, the Middle East, China, Japan, North Africa, Latin America, the Americas, Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, all over the world where the African peoples were scattered and enslaved as part of a global enrichment strategy. These communities, the descendants of these peoples, are now calling for recognition and global justice. But critically, this conversation is connected to the indigenous genocide history that preceded the African enslavement. And thus, for example, we all know of Haiti. We know the name Haiti. The French have called the island Saint-Domingue. The Spanish called it Santo Domingo. The Africans liberated it, abolished slavery, ended colonization, and reverted to the indigenous name. The indigenous Kalinago people had called their home Haiti. And so the African government renamed the island Haiti to respect the indigenous peoples. And the great speech given by Dessalines when he declared national independence, that we are going to pay respect to the indigenous people of this island who had fought against colonization and were defeated, thus linking the African history to the indigenous history. Then, after slavery is abolished, people of Asia, India especially, are brought into these colonial spaces as cheap labor to replace the Africans. So millions of working class Indian people are corralled into contracts of indenture and shipped around the plantation world so that capitalist plantation agriculture could continue. The descendants of these people are also demanding justice. And so we have indigenous peoples demanding justice, African peoples demanding justice, Asian people demanding justice, thus the globalization of this process. And as historians, we have said, these are the three acts of one play. They are not separate episodes of history. They are the three acts of a single play. Nature genocide, African enslavement, the deceptive indenture of the Asian people. And these moments And these movements have now joined hands. So on the one hand, I'm giving a lecture at the UN as part of the declaration of the decade, a decade for African peoples. And while I am speaking in the UN about reparatory justice, there is a motion taking place in the Indian Parliament, where the Parliament of India is calling for reparatory justice, not only in respect of the enslavements of African peoples in India, but also the destruction of Indian agriculture and Indian industry by British colonizers in the 19th centuries, thus pushing India deeper into poverty, destruction of the agricultural system, the destruction of the machinery technology, so that Britain could effectively run India as its largest colony. All of these conversations are now linked. So now we are in the middle of a global dialogue. We have been invited as experts in this subject into the Middle East, into Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to look at African enslavement through the Middle East. As you all know, there's evidence of African enslavement into the Middle East into the 1920s, as late as that, almost 100 years after abolition of slavery in the Western world. So this is where we are now. The Caribbean, I believe, is at the center of much of this. And there's a reason why the Caribbean is at the center of much of this. It's because it all started in the Caribbean. This is where Columbus entered the Americas. This is where Columbus entered. 12th of October, 1492, Columbus arrived in the Bahamas. All hell broke loose after that. War on the indigenous peoples, slavery to follow, Asian indenture to follow, and now all of us are cleaning up this mess, the consequences of that intervention. The Caribbean becomes the site of all of this. And importantly, the island where I was born, Barbados, is the site of the first beginning. Barbados becomes the source of the experiment. Barbados is where the experiment was first conducted. What was the experiment? The experiment was a modern business model that it is possible to arrive on an island, purchase a few hundred acres of land, import 5,000 Africans across an Atlantic, bring them to that location, bring capital out of London, put the capital to work and the enslaved people to work, produce a commodity, export that commodity all over the world, and make a profit. And make a profit larger than you would have made had you invested that money at home. The British economy was offering investors in the 17th century 3-4% return, but if you could invest in the Caribbean slave plantation, and you invest in importing labor, importing food from North American colonies, Virginia, Carolinas, bring the food down, bring the labor across, bring the capital in, export this sugar, make 12-15%. On a good year, you might make 30-40%. Oh, this was heaven. For any investor, this was heaven, and Barbados was a place that showed this model could work. And thus, Barbados became the island where, for the first time in the Americas, the African population became the majority. Barbados becomes the first society in the Americas where African peoples outnumbered Europeans. And this happened very early, 1650. By 1650, the Africans were the majority. The business model had worked. The business model had been so effective that these investors in Barbados became the richest people in the Americas. Having made their fortunes in Barbados, they wanted to expand. And thus, they went back to England, to the king, and they said to King Charles, well, we need to expand, we need room, we need land. So they bought South Carolina, okay. They bought South Carolina, and they paid their dues to King Charles II, and they got South Carolina. Up the Barbadians came to build South Carolina. Thus, South Carolina becomes an extension, a diaspora of Barbados. The Jamaicans did very, very well. Jamaican slave owners, and they too wanted to expand. They came into Pennsylvania. They came into Virginia. They brought the wealth from the Caribbean, and they invested in tobacco and rice, having mastered the art of sugar production. And so these Caribbean slave owners were the ones who eventually established most of the large slave plantation systems in this country. And this is not surprising. Of course, it's logical that South Carolina becomes the first state in this country with a black majority, because they were from Barbados. The first place where there was a black majority, the Yemans and the Colletons and the Middletons, all of those distinguished families who were able to buy up South Carolina. And these connections are everywhere. So we had Caribbean slave owners coming north and bring in the African slavery with them. The folks in this country were quite prepared up to 1700 to go along with their own business model. Their business model was based on importing working class people from Europe to perform indentured contract labor. Virginia wanted that. Most of them wanted to go ahead with this model of bringing working class people from Europe to perform the labor function. But this business model from the Caribbean, this juggernaut, this chattel slavery concept was emerging, erupting, and pushing all of that aside until finally the colonists in this country had no choice. Embrace it. It's the latest paradigm. And they did. The same thing was taking place in South America. How many people know that Suriname used to be called Willoughby Land? Willoughby Land because the governor of Barbados in the 1650s was Francis Lord Willoughby, who took Suriname, having made his fortune in Barbados. And Suriname became known as Willoughby Land because these guys were taking this model all over the world. The descendants are now calling for a kind of justice around this history. And this is why we say that this 21st century is a century of a global movement. What's the sequence of thought? It took 300 years to establish slavery as a global paradigm, chattel slavery in its modern form, as opposed to slavery in ancient forms. We make a fundamental distinction between the modern and ancient forms, because in the modern forms, human beings were defined as non-human, as chattel, as property, and real estate. Those were not features of the ancient forms. In the ancient forms, some interesting things could happen. You were in and out of slavery, and you were in and out of various forms of oppression, but your humanity was not legally suppressed. We have seen no evidence in any of the ancient societies that persons classified as enslaved were treated in the legislation and the constitutions of the society as non-human. That never happened. And this is important because when you come to understand the abolition legislation, then you will see the predicament. 1830s, slavery is being abolished by law in the parliaments of Europe. England, later on France, Holland, all of them. But they decided to pay compensation to the slave owners because the state is taking away the private property of individuals. In most democracies, if the state is going to take the property of private citizens, they have to give them fair and just compensation. And so, the owners of these Africans, the 600,000 in the Caribbean islands, the owners of them have to be compensated. So what you do, you put a market value, the accountants and the actuarial scientists go to work, and the value of the 600,000 enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, in the English colonies, was computed at 47 million pounds. And so there's 47 million pounds of assets. And these assets are now going to be liquidated. They're privatized back to the persons whose bodies the labor isn't still. Now, the enslaved people then said, hold on a second, how about us? we are the ones who are entitled to the compensation. We are the ones who have labored for free for 300 years. We are the ones who should be a part of this compensation discussion. But the Parliament said, but you guys are not human. How can we pay compensation to non-humans? You don't pay compensation to a horse or cow or sheep or goat. You're not human. So how can we contemplate the possibility? So the enslaved continue to send their petitions. And they sent their petitions to the British Parliament, to the French Parliament, put up their hand, we need compensation. Now, here's the legal predicament. If you're going to pay compensation, you have to first of all establish that the thing you have taken from someone else is property. And if the British Parliament is going to pay compensation to these slave owners, the first thing the British Parliament has to do is to classify these 600,000 people as non-human and property. That's the first step. Because that is going to be the basis on which the compensation can be paid. In other words, the Parliament is going to inform the Treasury to identify a pool of money to be transferred to these citizens, and the purpose of the transfer is property compensation. And so in all of the acts of emancipation, in each act of emancipation, the Africans were classified as non-human and property. That becomes the precursor to enable the compensation to be paid. In the case of the British Caribbean, the £47 million was the total value. The British Parliament said, we're not going to pay you £47 million, but we're going to give you half of that. So, okay, so we're going to give you 20 million. Now, £20 million in 1833 is 40% of national expenditure. 40% of Britain's national expenditure was going to be taken by the Treasury and handed over to slave owners. Not surprisingly, because the vast majority of the members in the House of Parliament were slave owners. So, in other words, these guys are sitting in Parliament as slave owners. They pass a bill to compensate themselves, to raid the Treasury, to take all the money out of the Treasury, to transfer it to themselves. And they agreed, okay, well, 20 million is not bad. Then the Emancipation Act was crafted in such a way that the slave owners would then get the balance, which is 27 million. How was it done? The Emancipation Act said, as from today, August 1st, you are free, but you have to work for free for another 6 years. Because that for free, after you are free, will work off and work away the balance of 27 million pounds of additional labor. So the slave owner got his 47 million. Again, all of this happened very skillfully because of power. You have the parliamentary power to do this, and therefore you do it. So in the first round, enslaved people got nothing. But their voice was always in the conversation. The parliaments of Europe just said, your reparations is the fact that we have freed you. That is your reparations. For us, it is financial. For you, it is legal. Therein lies the inequality. And so we have said that those emancipation acts that were passed in the Western world, all of these acts of emancipation were fundamentally racist acts of legislation, because at the core of all of them is that the subject of the legislation were not human. Therein lies the predicament. Now, it took all of the 19th century to uproot slavery from the modern world. It was a long struggle. It took 100 years to get rid of chattel slavery. First in Haiti, 1804, and then later on, ultimately, this country, and finally, Brazil and Cuba at the end of the 19th century. So it took 100 years of revolution and legislation to uproot this evil that had been in place for 400 years. So the beneficiaries of this knew that they were into an intergenerational struggle. The enslaved people in Brazil, the enslaved people in Cuba, had to wait 50 years after the peoples of the English islands were free. 40 years after the people in the Spanish and the French-speaking islands were free. 20 years after the African peoples in this country were free, the Cubans and the Brazilians were still waiting. And it's interesting to examine Haitian history because how things have changed. Between 1804, when Haiti declared itself a free nation, abolishing slavery forever, abolishing racial discrimination forever, declaring the humanity of all human beings, and becoming the first nation in the world to put democracy into practice beyond the theory, but to do it. And Haiti has not got the philosophical respect for being the first nation in the Western world to build a constitution on the fundamental equality of all humans and to enforce it. They haven't got the legal or the philosophical respect for that contribution to Western democracy because they do not have the political power to write the narrative. And so, yes, Washington says some interesting things. Jefferson, and the U.S. built their economy and society on slavery. Yes, they declared the nation state, but they proceeded to build the nation that they had fought for on slavery. The Haitians said, no, it doesn't work. It has to be complete and total. So we took that fundamental decision in the Caribbean, making the Caribbean, therefore, the first site of chattel slavery and the first site of democracy after chattel slavery. The first site to turn this system upside down started in Haiti, and the beginning also started in Haiti in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean is at the center of this conversation. It took all of the 19th century to get rid of it. Then it took us all of the 20th century to get human rights and civil rights. 100 years to uproot slavery, and then another 100 years of the 20th century to get human rights and civil rights embedded in the constitutions of this hemisphere. So, stage one, uproot the system. Stage two, uproot the legacies. Legacies are still being debated. Stage three, reparatory justice. And this long 21st century is going to be the century where all over the world, this movement is going to gain pace and it's going to gallop until there is a perception that justice is acquired. Now, I am not suggesting to you that history has a mechanical logic to it. But I do believe that there is an evolving philosophical sense of how to turn the world's right way up. And at the basis of that is the notion of justice. What does it mean? Reparations means different things to different people. In most places in the Western world, the mainstream media will say, okay, reparations is about black dudes hanging around on street corners wanting money from white people. And that is how the media presents it. The mainstream media says we have to kill this movement. We have to destroy this movement. This movement is the antithesis of everything we stand for in the Western world. So therefore we must kill it all. And what we do, we define it. It's very similar to Martin Luther King, who said, my philosophy is social integration. And by social integration, he meant the right to jobs, the right to housing, and all of these things in this country. But the mainstream media said, oh, we know what he means. Martin Luther King really means, he want black dudes to marry white girls. That's what he really means by integration. And all hell broke loose. It depends on who defines the narrative. CARICOM has rolled out a strategy for reparations. And this is what it means from our perspective. CARICOM has a 10-point plan, which has been accepted by all of the governments of the Caribbean. First of all, there has to be a fundamental apology for this crime that has been committed. not a statement of regret. There is this fundamental difference between the apology and the statement of regret. Most of the Western countries have issued statements of regret. Bill Clinton issued a statement of regret. Prime Minister Blair of Britain issued a statement of regret. Statement of regret says, well, we don't believe we have done anything wrong. We're not taking responsibility for any of the consequences of the past. But we recognize that there is some pain, and for this we regret it. Now, that is how statements of regret are understood. Apologies are altogether different. Apologies are structured along the following lines. What we did was wrong. The wrong that we committed has caused hurt and pain. We have a duty to participate in a dialogue to repair the harm that we have done. And finally, that we make an ethical and moral commitment that we will not repeat it. This is why the apology has these 4 levels of conversations. And in that third instance, that we will commit to a dialogue of repair, that therein lies the concept of reparations. How do we begin to repair? What is there to be repaired? If you take Jamaica, for example, Jamaica has a large community of black folks who have embraced a religion called Rastafarianism. The Rastafarians have said from the very beginning, we are stolen people. We are stolen people. We don't want to discuss slavery and legacies. We are stolen people, and we demand the right to return from whence we came. All stolen people have a right to return from whence they came. For the Rastafarians, that is their reparation. They wish to be returned from whence they came. For other folks, they wish to have conversations about technology transfer, agricultural development, better education, better healthcare. Why it is that the descendants of enslaved peoples have the highest profiles of hypertension and diabetes? Why is there an epidemic among the descendants of the enslaved with chronic diseases caused by centuries of stress, torture, malnutrition? These are issues. How do we cure this pandemic that's evolving across the Caribbean and the African world? How do we address these matters? What technology do we need? What medical science do we need to collaborate between the Western world and its legacy communities to cure these ills? How is it that no Caribbean child can speak an African language when all of the ancestors came from West Africa? What was the nature of that disconnection where a people know nothing about their roots? What can we do in the area of education and institution building to connect people meaningfully from the places where they came from? For different communities, it means different things. But I do not know of any community that says we want to hang around on street corners and demand handouts from white folks. I think the conversation says that all of those folks who have benefited from this need to recognize this, accept responsibility, and participate in actions of repair. When I was in high school in Britain, our school would take kids every year to summer trips to Rome and Greece, because it was believed that white English kids should know that the source of their civilization is Rome and Greece. And all the kids would go to the Acropolis and the Pantheon and to see Greek history, the rise of ancient European civilization. And we would go to the Colosseum and see how the Greeks have handed down to us democracy. And guess what? They have a right to that. I tagged along. I tagged along on all of those trips to Greece and Rome, and I marveled at these structures of ancient European culture. But while I was marveling, I was saying, but how about me? Why can't someone take me to Nigeria or to Ghana and show me something? Why can't someone take me to Egypt and show me the pyramids? Why can't someone show me these things? Where's the school that's going to take these black kids to see their roots? How about us? No black school does that in the Caribbean. Who's going to fund that? Do we need a development fund where we can connect a whole generation of young people to their roots to build their identity for their personal health? Who will fund that? How come there isn't a museum that looks at slavery in the entire Caribbean? Who's going to fund that? Am I going to ask the government of Jamaica to give me $50 million to build a slavery museum when they need primary schools and secondary schools and housing? Who's going to fund these kind of issues? Whose responsibility it is to participate in cleaning up this mess? And it is a mess. The legacies of slavery everywhere have left this mess behind. And I have seen it all over the world. And people, young people especially, are saying, we cannot live in this 21st century in the way we lived in the 20th century. We're not going to accept this. There has to be a cure to all of this. There has to be an explanation to all of this. You go into the ghettos of the black world and you see people, ghettos from Brazil to New York, from Chicago all the way down to Rio, and you see all of these black people trapped in these ghettos in the entire hemisphere. And for many white folks, oh, this is normal. Oh, so black folks live in ghettos everywhere. Everywhere, so what's the big deal? How come? How come? What happened? How come? This is an imagery of the hemisphere. You know, we went down to Rio because many folks don't know that the majority of African peoples enter the Americas through Rio. Rio was the largest importer of Africans in the entire colonial period. That is not well known. So we're in Rio doing the studies. And if you haven't been to Rio, well, next time you go to the Valenga port. It's a very interesting place. The Valenga port was where over 5 million Africans were disembarked. But something peculiar happened about 10 years ago. There was this beautiful suburban community for upper middle class folks. Beautiful, gated community. And people bought these houses, you know, 80,000 US, 200,000 US, lovely homes. Then one day, this woman, who happens to be a history professor at the university, she has 2 sons, and her sons are musicians. And she decided, well, my 2 sons want to be musicians, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to dig up the basement and create a little studio for my 2 sons in the basement. Good. So she got the contractors in to excavate the basement to create this studio for her sons to play their drums and their guitars. And as they're digging up the basement, these bones begin to come up from the ground. Dozens and dozens of bones are coming up from the ground. Then we discovered that the entire estate was built on a slave cemetery. And it wasn't a normal slave cemetery. It was a special cemetery because under maritime law, if a slave, an enslaved African on the slave ship, if an enslaved African on the slave ship died in sight of land, you cannot throw the body into the water. If the person dies in sight of land, you have to bring the body onshore and bury it. For 200 years, the slave owners, the slave traders into Brazil were taking all of these bodies of persons who died on the ocean and dumping them in this area. Slave trade is abolished. Everyone has forgotten. Now they built this huge, beautiful estate on top of this cemetery. But it was a landfill. It wasn't like you couldn't put African bodies in little graves. You just dumped them. It was a dumping ground. But guess what? In between the bodies are also the bones of dogs. Because the Africans and the dogs and everything that died were thrown into the same place. So now we have to sift through all of these bones to excavate that these are humans, these are dogs, these are horses, these are cows, and separate out the humans from all the others. This woman did something remarkable. She said, I'm going to excavate all of my foundations. My bedroom, my living room, my kitchen, and now she has built a glass floor through her entire house. And her house is now a museum. So you enter the front door, and as you see on there, you see the bones. You go right into the living room, the bones. The television room, the bones. The kitchen, bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, everything now has a glass floor, and it's a house built on bones. And many other people have done the same thing. The history cannot be hidden. And the people in Rio are now preparing their struggle for reparatory justice. So all over the world, this is the campaign. And I believe that all of us in universities have a role to play to bring this moment and this movement to maturity. It might take us 100 years, but let it be. As I said, it took us 100 years. Good people. It took good people 100 years to uproot slavery. It took us another 100 years to create human rights and civil rights and democracies. And if it's going to take us another 100 years to have justice for the descendants of these people, and in much the same way that universities were critical in the construction of that prior history, I believe universities have a role to play in its deconstruction and the creation of a better just world. I thank you for the generosity of your patience. Thank you very much.
Sir, Hilary Beckles is open to taking questions, of course. If you'd like to come down, we have 2 microphones set up. So please do come down unless you feel you can amplify your voice sufficiently. Feel free to come down. Amplification is important.
First of all, I want to thank you for a tremendously powerful, wonderful, educational lecture. I've never heard anything like this in some time. Thank you very much for what you have educated me. My question has to do with the notion of, and I'm not trying to be an apologist by any means, but the notion of civilization and sort of making people civilized, or however that was defined, that very often, and I'm speaking because of my religious sort of readings and training and so on, missionaries and church people and so on would say that we are bringing civilization to these individuals. Some of them were sort of maybe even seen as sort of subversive because they did things that say Moses did not want. But I encourage that reading, I'm not reading, teaching slaves to read, but they earnestly believed that Africans were becoming human, and they were civilizing. That was their earnest. How do we deconstruct or at least try to understand that? To get my idea.
Well, I return to the concept of in the national interest. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when this structure was being developed, simply because investors needed cheap labor to take advantage of an opportunity. Columbus came across the Atlantic. A whole frontier was now seen as available to investors. Europeans have been looking for new investment opportunities for 200 years. Europeans have been traveling to Asia. It wasn't so good because they found that Asia had highly developed commercial systems and their citizens were protected by forms of governance they couldn't have access to. They found nations that had strong militaries and therefore they could not extract the people from those places. And so they went all the way to Southeast Asia, they went to China, Japan, they traveled around and they're looking for labor. Now, the Columbus thing opens up a frontier and labor is now the critical issue, and they came to believe that they could commodify their pool of African labor. Now, they did the economics. They did the economics. My own dissertation was a study of the economics of that choice. Because if you go into West Africa and you make arrangements to purchase a male for, let's say, 30 pounds and a female for 25 pounds, and then you want to ship them across the Atlantic, the average slave ship carried about 300 enslaved Africans. The average slave ship took about 8 weeks to get from West Africa to this part of the world. The average slave ship had about a 30% mortality loss. So you invested in 300 people at, on average, 25 pounds each. A third of them are going to die across the Atlantic. Then another 15% will die in the first year of the labor. And you run your mortality analysis and your calculations, but you're going to plant a crop. And you're going to run the numbers and the business model work. Now, when you realize that the business model is going to work, now you have to justify this. You have to rationalize it. And there are lots of people who are saying, as I said before, that this isn't wrong, this is a crime, this is sinful, this is immoral. But you have to suppress those voices. And you need a language that will enable you to suppress that opposition. Because the business proposition, the numbers have worked out. So you begin the process of rationalizing your choice. These are not people, they're not human. And therefore, if they are not people and they're subhuman, then we have a moral right to enslave them. Now, then you have to argue against the moral circumstance, which says, well, hold on a second. But if they are subhuman, or even if they are culturally inferior, isn't that every reason why you should not enslave them, but to participate in their upliftment? No, so you have to get around that argument as well. So you get around that argument by saying, well, hold on a second. Slavery is a learning institution. It is through their enslavement that we will elevate them. It is through their long-term enslavement that we will do what we want to do, which is to bring them up to our standard. Slavery is the institution through which they must go in order to be elevated. So you have this phenomenal set of rationalizations going on. But the rationalizations are taking place in the face of opposition rationalization. And then, every now and then, you would have a contradictory moment. One of my favorite contradictory moments is the story around John Newton, who had made 24 voyages as a slave trader to the Caribbean, English slave trader. Then he writes this interesting narrative that one day, while he is purchasing a cargo of Africans at Whydah, which is now part of the nation of Benin, he saw the most beautiful thing in the world. He saw a naked African woman on an auction block. And as a man who had appreciated art, he said he had never seen anything more beautiful. The shape, the proportions, the composition, and the beauty, and he's struck by this. Now, he has to sell this thing when he gets to the Caribbean. Now, he comes and he sells the thing, but he is haunted by what he has done. It's like, he describes it as an act of desecration. Now, he goes back to England. He's gripped by what has happened to him. And he runs into a monastery and asks God for help. That his soul has been destroyed to its core. And he spends the next 5 years in a monastery seeking spiritual enlightenment to purge himself of the horror he had inflicted upon these people for 20 years. And it was in the moment of that reflection that he wrote that beautiful hymn that we all love so much, Amazing Grace. Now, Amazing Grace is arguably the most beautifully moving recognition of the power of God. So he writes this. Now, could he have written that classic of the poetic spiritual voice without that reflection? Very few people were prepared to go into that world of redemption. Now, he did, and many others did. What we're talking about even today, how many of us today are willing to enter that world of redemption, of deep reflection, of knowing that the language that was used to justify this world, it was mythical. It was lies, fake news, lies, fake news, because the business model had to work.
Really fascinating talk. My question, I think your point would be really important, that repair means different things to different people. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more concretely about, I don't know if I speak for everybody in the room, I think most of us probably agree on some level that reparation is in order, but can you speak more concretely about steps that have been taken, perhaps in other places, or funds that have been established, or things that we might be able to contribute to, like, concretely? Because I've had this happen with students where we talk generally about the need for reparation, and then when we get down to, okay, what should we do? People are like, well, I don't want anybody taking money from me, or taxes, so it's like, then it comes into like, oh, wait, it's a good idea generally. I think most of us agree with that. Then what concretely, can you speak about concrete steps or concrete things we could do, or countries that have actually engaged in effective reparation movements?
Well, the first concrete action is to understand and recognize and accept that the privileges that you enjoy in your society were handed down to you through a process of history.
Yep.
Now, if you're prepared to say, not my taxes, not my money, not my anything, then you're not ready for the conversation. You become ready for the conversation when, as a citizen in a modern nation, you have come to realize that either privately or collectively, that you have been the beneficiary of all of these crimes that have been committed. Now, in modern law, the state can raid your home and say, your grandfather gave you all of this money, and your grandfather was a drug trader, so we're going to appropriate all of these assets.
Yeah.
The laws provide for that right now, that you can appropriate the assets of those who have committed crimes. And therefore, the descendants who have benefited from those crimes have no moral or legal right to those assets. But that's not where we go. What we're talking about, let's say the Caribbean 10-point plan. The first item on the plan is the formal apology. The second item is the creation of a fund for the returning of all of those Africans who wish to be returned as stolen people. At the moment, there are 7 countries in Africa that have passed legislation to accept these people if they so want to return. South Africa, Ghana, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia have all legislated that any descendants of enslaved peoples who wish to return and to settle and become citizens, they are most welcome. I was just 2 years ago over at Shashamani, Ethiopia, a town which is built almost entirely by people who have returned, and mostly from islands across the region and elsewhere. The third item deals with the issue of public health. There is a public health disaster in all of these descendant communities. All of these communities are suffering with the same basic conditions. If you take a people and you put them on a sugar plantation, a rice plantation, a cotton plantation, and you feed them salt fish and salt pork every day, you work them 20 hours a day, you sell their wives, you sell their children, you rape their daughters, and you take them through that journey for 400 years, what do you get? You get a stress profile that no human beings in the world has ever had to endure. So what the African peoples have had to endure is absolutely unprecedented in terms of the stress profiles that have now resulted in this incapacity to metabolize salt and sugar. Now what is interesting is that we are now doing that comparative research. 60% of all the black people in the Caribbean over the age of 60 are diabetic, and 60% are hypertensive. That is, the majority of black adults in the Caribbean are hypertensive and diabetic. Now, this explosion is nothing new. I know the medics like to say, well, we've been studying this matter and it's a new profile. No. As historians, we have seen this evidence on the slave plantations in the 18th century and the 19th century. We have seen the overseers writing in the plantation, oh, the slaves are lazy, they're sleeping, they're dropping down at work, and so on. And all the symptoms of insulin rejection and insulin insufficiency. Lazy, lethargic, no energy, your sores won't heal, the level of amputation on those estates. You're working on a farm, you get a cut on your foot, it doesn't heal, they cut your foot off, gangrene. The plantation records are filled with this information. So it's not a new thing, this diabetic explosion that has taken place in the black community. It's an ancient thing that goes back. Now, what is interesting is that the comparative research has shown, for example, that the ancestral communities don't have this problem. So we have done studies in Nigeria, in Ghana, Senegal, where the people came from. There is no hypertensive and diabetic problem in West Africa. It is the descendants of those people that have the problem. And if you take now the biomechanics, the biochemistry of the situation, if you take a typical hypertensive drug, there are about 7 or 8 major drugs that people take for hypertension. Now, the Europeans, or people of European ancestry, they have a 95% response to these drugs. You take these drugs, the body takes the message, it makes the adjustment, and you have a 95% response. The identical drug, if I took it, I would have a 65% response to the same drug. Now, but let's say my ancestors came out of Ghana. But you go to Ghana, and the Ghanaians have the same response as yourself. So the West Africans have the same magnificent response to the drugs as European peoples. Who have the suppressed response? Diaspora peoples, the descendants of the enslaved. What has happened? Have we been genetically modified? What happened? That our ancestors have the same medical response as white people, and we don't. Now, we have a lot of research being done to modify these drugs. The pharmaceuticals will say to you, oh, there are only 15 million black people in the Caribbean. We're not going to spend $10 billion to modify these drugs to accommodate 10 million people in the Caribbean. If the Africans had this problem, if 150 million Africans had this problem, yes, we will modify the drugs, huge market. But why should? So let's say we in the Caribbean, we know what to do. We have the biochemistry, we know how to modify the drugs, but do we have the billions of dollars to do the research? No, we don't. Now, How do we deal with that? Reparations. Now, and you go right through. Education. Education. We do not have a circumstance where the infrastructure of learning are yet ready to absorb this history. Most black people in the American South, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, know nothing about their history, their ancestry. They know nothing about it. Because that was the nature of slavery, to cut you off completely from your sources of culture and to enforce it. In fact, even to retain your name, you could lose your life for keeping your name. But we all know the story of King Coulee. Now, how do you reverse these processes? These are massive educational projects to reverse these things. The CARICOM strategy is calling for a dialogue of how to treat with these issues on a global basis. And which is why the CARICOM governments, through the Commission, have written to every government of Europe, formally, all the prime ministers of Europe whose countries were involved in this process. All of these governments have been formally written to, calling for a global summit to discuss this matter. Of course, the first round of conversations are very simple. Oh, we know there's a problem with black people in the Caribbean. Oh no, we know that the descendants of the enslaved do have special problems. But reparations is not the way to go. We will increase your aid. We will increase your aid. Who needs aid? You need development. Aid says, oh, here's some cash, no, take it and go away. That has been the response. CARICOM is saying we need development cooperation. We need to sit and plan for these things in a coherent way to repair this damage that has been done to these people, to repair. So there are many instances that would constitute projects of reparations. And there are projects from education, from health, from culture, and these are significant projects that will help us to repair this issue. Because the legacy of slavery and colonization has overwhelmed the governments of the Caribbean. This legacy has overwhelmed them. And many of you will hear in the newspaper, all of these governments have a fiscal problem. They're all overspending. They are spending more than they have. Now, take Jamaica. Jamaica became independent in 1962. Britain had been managing Jamaica as a slavery colony from 1655. From 1655 to 1962, it was a British colony. 1962, Britain says, okay, you want your independence now? Take it and go. 70% of the black people can't read or write. 70% of them cannot read or write at independence, and the British government says, now you are independent, go and develop. What country can develop in the 20th century with a 70% literacy? What are the skills bases? What skills do you have to build a nation? And despite the fact that the Jamaicans have done magnificently and taken the rubble of colonization and have built a nation in which they can be proud, the rubble is still there to be cleaned up, and it's overwhelming them. Housing, malnutrition, illiteracy, education systems, inadequate schools. Britain walked away. Well, we have said to Britain, you cannot create this mess and walk away from it. You need to come back here and sit with this government and look at education, housing, infrastructure, help to clean up this mess we have created. It is part of your responsibility as well.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, and thank you very much for an extremely moving presentation. So I feel kind of strange asking this follow-up question because it's about cold hard cash. I should mention that I had the great honor of presenting a paper on reparations for slavery, the slave trade and colonialism at a conference in Gambia last year. And part of my job was to look at proposals that had actual dollar values associated with them. And there were many about slavery in the United States, some about the slave trade in Africa, and some about a combination of slave trade and colonialism also from Africa. And I came across the CARICOM's 10-point proposal, but I couldn't find any dollar amounts associated with them. And so I was wondering whether that was on purpose, or whether whether you have approached these European governments with with rough estimates of what order of magnitude we're talking about. So I would be interested to hear something about that.
Well, one does not know a money value in a process of repairing. What one does is to call for a conversation that identifies significant projects to help to rebuild a circumstance. After the Second World War, for example, the American government rolled out a Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. When they started, they had no idea what the money value would be. What they knew was that they had to get Europe back on its feet because, in their judgment, Europe is ancestral culture. And these are our forebears. So we need to put Europe back into a functional basis. We have to rebuild the agriculture. We have to rebuild the train stations. We have to rebuild the railway tracks. We have to rebuild the bridges. We have to help the people with education. We have to do all of that kind of work. And they did what they had to do. The question is, why is it that these imperial powers never gave these societies a Marshall Plan? All the Caribbean governments were entitled to a Marshall Plan at independence. After 500 years of colonization that come to an end, these islands were entitled to a Marshall Plan. It was asked for, it was requested. All through the 1930s and 40s and 50s, these colonial peoples were saying, as we prepare for independence, we need to have a structure that will enable trade and finance and infrastructure development to make these nations viable. The hostility out of France, and by the way, the French position is, in relation to colonized people, France has never given independence to a colony. The French position is once you're a colony, you stay a colony. And if you want independence, you fight for it. France has never participated and have never been willing. And part of the reasons why they're having this difficulty with Haiti is because Haiti had defeated them. And it's like a chicken bone stuck in their throat. They can't get over it. That Napoleon's army got a whooping in Haiti. They just cannot, and it's 200 years ago, and they cannot get over the fact that Napoleon got a whooping. And not one, but two. Now, and it's a problem for them. But they need to get over it. Now, I don't know what such a money value would be. What I can tell you is that there are certain markers. Take one marker. The slave owners in the Caribbean received 20 million pounds. 20 million pounds in compensation. The contemporary value of that is 9 billion pounds. If you take that as a simple marker, 9 billion pounds is about half of the gross national product of Britain. Now, if you say, well, the 20 million pounds that you gave the slave owners, now you give it to these people who have a right to it. That's half of the national income of the whole country. So that marker doesn't help. So you need another marker. And you say, okay, let us take as a marker the debt that the colonies developed before they became independent. Now, I want you to imagine that your father and your grandfather built up a massive debt in the pursuit of their business. And then they both died, and you become 18 years old. You're a man, and someone says, you see this debt that your father and your grandfather built is now yours. You now have to carry it. You begin your life at 18 with your father's and your grandfather's debt. That's what happened to the colonies. All of these nations that became independent, the debt that was built up by the British and the French in those societies when they were colonies, that debt was rolled over into the new nation. And the new nation began their journey with this imperial debt hanging over them. Let us look, therefore, at what the Caribbean debt was in 1960, for example, when the countries began to enter independence. You put a value on that? You're somewhere in the region of $300 billion in today's money. These markers help you to understand the extent to which these societies beginning their journey as independent nations, did not stand a chance. Did not stand a chance. My island, Barbados, where I was born, is now known as the amputation capital of the world. That's one of the identities of Barbados. Look at these two identities. The first slave society, and by slave society, we don't define a slave society as a society with slaves. There were many societies that had enslaved people in them, but those enslaved people were minorities. A slave society, we define them as a place where the enslaved people are the majority, and where the economy is entirely dependent upon the labor of these people, where the constitution is built on slavery. So Barbados becomes the society that is classified as the first slave society in the modern world. That same society is now called the amputation capital of the world, because more people are having arms and legs amputated per day in Barbados than in any other country in the world. What is the connection between these two histories? It is that the people are addicted to sugar because of the nature of the history. The first sugar plantation, for 300 years, people ate what they produce. You ate what you grew. When I was a child in primary school in Barbados, I used to go to school with a pound of sugar. Your grandparents will give you a pound of sugar. You would go to school with a satchel of sugar, a pound of sugar, and you would eat sugar as a meal. We ate sugar as a meal. Now, you now find that the people cannot metabolize sugar, and diabetes has gone rampant through the society. They are victims of their history, and now we have this horrendous diabetic problem where young people and elderly people are losing their legs and arms every single day. That's the reputation of an island. Now, 300 years ago, this island was classified as the richest spot of earth in the world, because these people were making so much wealth. They were the richest people in the world, the slave owners who made sugar. And now the descendants of these people are now the sickest people in the world. So if you take the marker, chronic diseases, non-communicable chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, take that as a marker. The black people in the Caribbean are the sickest people in the world, because there is no other community in the world other than maybe Mississippi, which is competing. The Caribbean peoples, using that criteria, black folks are the sickest people in the world. Now, I know we all have this image of the Caribbean as athletic and Usain Bolt and all those brilliant athletes, but beneath that image is a profile of sickness. How do we treat with that? We cannot cope with it because it has overwhelmed us. It's an issue to be repaired. So if you want projects, there are so many projects to deal with to repair this damage that has been done to a victimized community. This is what we have invited the European governments to do. Come to a summit to discuss projects that can help to repair this legacy that you have created, which is a modern, contemporary legacy.
We are actually out of time, but please join me in thanking our distinguished guests. There are books that Sir Hilary Beckles has authored, one being Britain's Black Debt and The First Slave Society, which are available out in the lobby. We have refreshments in the reception area, so please join us for further conversation. And dinner will also follow soon after the reception and the book sales.